So, students, I need to talk to you about civil rights during the Gilded Age, mainly focusing on the relationship between African Americans and European descent Americans, particularly in the South, is what we'll be focusing on today. Of course, after Reconstruction, that ushered in a period that we often refer to as Jim Crow. When you hear the term Jim Crow, that refers to a state law dealing with segregation. Okay, so if we hear Jim Crow, we're talking about segregation, which is discrimination against African Americans. Now, Jim Crow, though that existed, it really started in the 1870s after Reconstruction ended, with states passing those kinds of laws. Now, this was tested by a Supreme Court case, most famously the case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 is one of the key court cases you need to know for U.S. history. What the Supreme Court did essentially was to say, hey, segregation can exist. It is constitutional, and they waited on the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. But they do add a regulation to segregation. Segregation would then have to meet the criteria of separate but equal. However, the Supreme Court did not, in fact, define what equal was. And that leaves a gray area, and segregation exists. Is it equal quantity of facilities? Is it equal quality of facilities? Well, it ended up not being equal at all. And we've all seen the images of the white versus colored water fountains, etc. So Jim Crow was it lasted, essentially they say, particularly legal from 1896 up until 1964 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. However, it had been whittled away a little bit before that. But back to the Gilded Age, as far as this goes, I want you to understand, in the South, this was de jure segregation. That's segregation by law. And, that's going to end up being a major hurdle. Well, because of the discrimination that was going on in the South, you do have several activists sort of come to be well known during this time period. Here we are sitting in North Mississippi, and I would be completely remiss if I did not mention Miss Ida B. Wells, who was born just a few miles from here in Holly Springs, Mississippi, but becomes a journalist in Memphis and a teacher, and she exposes the horror of lynching. Lynching occurred. Lynching, we often think of it as just a hanging, but lynching is actually a mob murder, which there's no trial, and that happened to a lot of African Americans during this time period. And she actually wrote articles about that, to the point that, and she was raising questions about lynchings that the Shelby County Sheriff in Memphis at that time actually had ruled them suicides, so that there would be no investigation. So she was bringing awareness to that. And so this got her in trouble. She had to flee the South. But she is one of those early civil rights activists in the post-Civil War period during the Gilded Age here, and she's well remembered for that. Lynching is a brutal thing that went on, and she was raising awareness to that. Now, she normally takes a back burner to the two most prominent civil rights activists during this time period. And they're from different areas of the country, and they have very, very different views of what should be done over civil rights. They are both working for the same goal, which is equality and end to discrimination. One, I put it as, one had sort of the crock pot method, which is a slow get to where it needs to be, and another one had a microwave method. He wanted it right now. He wasn't going to wait. So we'll start with him. His name is W.E.B. Du Bois. He actually is from Massachusetts. He was born after the Civil War. Now, in Massachusetts, obviously, he's dealing with a different kind of discrimination than he is in the South. There, they don't have de jure segregation, but there is what we call sort of de facto segregation, which is segregation by custom, but he is still discriminated against for being an African American. He does gain a degree from Harvard University, a PhD. He's the first African American to actually receive a PhD from Harvard University. But Harvard put all sorts of stipulations on him because he was African American. But W.B. Du Bois, he says that the way for the African American man or the black man to gain equality is to get education, particularly liberal arts education. He says that's the biggest thing is that so many, because it was illegal for slaves to be educated, that the black society in America was undereducated. And so he pushed for African Americans to go to liberal arts college. He also called for a talented tenth to come up and sort of be the leaders of African American society. So he encouraged that way, but he demanded equality now, and he's going to be an important founder of something called the Niagara Movement, which is a civil rights organization. It's pushing for equality and an end to discrimination for African Americans, and that is sort of the forerunner of an organization that W.B. Du Bois helps to found in 1909 called the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP still today is one of the major civil rights organizations in our country. But W.B. Du Bois, he did not agree with the other prominent civil rights activists during this time. He felt that the other one was sort of taking the easy way. He was being too cautious. But the other civil rights activist is Booker T. Washington. I'm sure you've all heard of Booker T. Washington. In fact, there's schools across the South named after Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was born in Alabama. He was born a slave. He was a child during the Civil War, so he experienced sort of the most brutal of discrimination for African Americans. His plan actually involved African Americans learning a trade. It's economic independence. He wanted them to have economic independence and learn a trade so that their work would have value, that it wasn't just unskilled farm labor necessarily. Booker T. Washington, he actually founds the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama, which is a trade school, and it's to train these African Americans in trades. And he says that through work in trades, African Americans will get respect, that the discrimination will dissipate, which is true. But like I said, his is sort of a long run goal. His is a long run goal in which he's, people are going to have to deal with some of that racism in the South so that they will eventually have equality. Well, W.B. Du Bois, he says this is unacceptable. We immediately need an end to discrimination. So they were at odds for a little bit. In 1895, down in Atlanta, they had the Atlanta Exposition, which was kind of like a weird southern cotton-filled World's Fair. And Booker T. Washington gave a keynote speech at the Atlanta Exposition. It's called the Atlanta Exposition Speech, in which he outlined his plan. He said sometimes we got to be patient, and they will have to earn that respect to end discrimination. Well, Du Bois didn't call this the Atlanta Exposition Speech. It's called the Atlanta Compromise Speech by him. And he says essentially that Booker T. Washington is compromising to allow racism and discrimination to continue. So they were at odds a great deal. Now, Booker T. Washington, to his credit, he's from the South. He had seen the most brutal of racism. So I kind of understand why he might not have been as radical as W.B. Du Bois. Okay, because he had seen sort of the worst of it. Now they're going to be at odds. Booker T. Washington, notably, he's the first African American to be invited to have dinner at the White House. He had dinner with Theodore Roosevelt. Du Bois sort of attacked him. Why would you go sit down with a president who's doing nothing for for civil rights. And Booker T. Washington, I kind of understand why he would have gone, because when else might he have gotten an audience with the President of the United States? But these guys, they are the prominent figures of civil rights during this time. There's not a ton of traction that occurs during the post-Reconstruction period. We're not going to have another Civil Rights Act until really 1957, when we started increasing federal protections, particularly for voter registration, that kind of thing. But during this period, we did have active civil rights activists. Basically, they are very prominent, and for instance, they do lead the movement on, particularly with the founding of the NAACP in 1909. Now, one other major topic that we have to talk about, other than Jim Crow, is actually voting rights. Okay, we know that suffrage means the right to vote, right? Also, franchise, one of the definitions is the right to vote. Well, African Americans were systematically disenfranchised across the South following Reconstruction. There were three main things that did this. One, most southern states required a literacy test. I know in Mississippi, what they required was you to read a section of the U.S. Constitution and interpret that. However, that section was chosen by whoever the voter registration officer was that was doing this. So this was not carried out in a fair manner at all. Well, the literacy test, well, guess what? Not just African Americans couldn't read in the South following the Civil War. There was a lot of illiterate white people also. So that would have eliminated a lot of people, wouldn't it? Another thing that went in was the poll tax, a tax to vote. Now, the poll tax originally was set up to actually pay the poll workers who were working the polls. But this became a way to disenfranchise people, because the poll tax, this was a tax that had to be paid every year so that you could vote. And you had the burden of proving that you had paid your poll tax every year so that you could vote. This particularly was discriminatory towards like sharecroppers, because they didn't necessarily have the means to pay the poll tax. In Mississippi, the last poll tax was $2. Now, $2 doesn't seem like very much in 2021 money, but when this was in place in the night before 1965, $2 was a good chunk of money. Also, to a sharecropper who was essentially living off of credit, they don't have the cash to do this. So the poll tax actually disenfranchised the poor people, okay? And in no way were African Americans the only poor people in the South, but more African Americans, a larger percentage of African Americans were poor than percentage of whites. So the poll tax, it was going to disenfranchise. Now here's where it gets more sinister. Most states enacted something called a grandfather clause. Now this grandfather clause, what it did was it exempted you from the literacy test and the poll tax if you could prove that you had a relative who voted in the election of 1860. The election of 1860 was the election that Abraham Lincoln got elected to the presidency the first time. So that would remove any chance of the majority of the freed slaves, the African American majority in the South. They would not be exempted from that. This made those laws no longer equal. So those were the main things that disenfranchised African Americans. Remember, disenfranchises take away the right to vote. Segregation has nothing to do with taking away the right to vote. Disenfranchise. Literacy test, poll tax, grandfather clause. Now, some states did also have what was called a white primary, where only white people could vote in the primary. That served the purpose of ensuring in those states that there would not be African American candidates. And that was enacted again in a lot of states following Reconstruction. So African Americans, they're going to have to deal with the discrimination during this time period because they don't really have a political voice. They are not the constituents of the congressman because they can't vote. Much like women, we have these women's movements like the temperance movement going on. They're not going to gain any traction for a while just because they don't have a political voice in most states. So this era that we don't have a lot of laws, but it's setting the groundwork for what's termed the modern civil rights movement that's going to come after World War II. It is important to know the key players and know what they were up against. During Reconstruction, yes, we did have in some southern states a rise of a group called the Ku Klux Klan. They kind of fade away for a while. That was mainly about scaring people away from the polls who were going to vote Republican. But they're going to rear their head again later in American history. And we'll talk about that. A lot of this is tied to nativism, too. The discrimination in the North against African Americans is almost like a twisted version of nativism. It's almost economic in nature. The Irish, who were working in those menial jobs, sort of the factory laborers and that kind of thing, they did not appreciate new groups moving to northern cities and competing for those jobs. And the African Americans, the now freed slaves during Reconstruction and right after that era, they are competing for those jobs with the Irishmen. So that leads to racism in the North too. But I want you to understand, in the North, there was not the de jure segregation, the segregation by law. There was de facto segregation, and that it was segregation by custom. And also, remember, we're dealing with a segregated military at this time too. So there was a lot of discrimination going on. So you want to make sure that you're familiar with those facts during this time, because we're sort of building the stage for the modern civil rights movement. So y'all study up for our test.